The key didn't fit.
I stood on the front porch of the house I had grown up in, pushing the key into the lock over and over.
My overnight bag kept sliding off my shoulder.
Through the front window, I could see my sister Nadine standing in the hallway with her arms folded, watching me struggle.
She didn't move.
She just waited until I gave up and knocked. Then she cracked the door just wide enough to speak. Her face was blank and still, like she had rehearsed this moment many times before. "You can't come in, Olivia. This isn't your house anymore."
My stomach dropped.
"What are you talking about?" Without a word, she pushed a thick envelope through the narrow gap. "Mom updated the will," she said flatly.
Then the door clicked shut.
I stood there holding the envelope, unable to move. We had buried our mother 3 days before. The relatives had only just gone home. I had come back to collect a few of my things, maybe sit quietly in the house for a while, the way you do when someone you love is gone and the world still feels unreal.
She had waited for exactly this moment.
When I was alone, grieving, and completely off guard. That was when I understood what she had really been doing all along. I sat down on the porch steps and opened the envelope with shaking hands. The papers were typed cleanly, signed at the bottom by a lawyer and 2 witnesses. They used words like sole beneficiary and executor of estate that I didn't fully understand yet.
But I understood enough.
The house, our childhood home on Ridgecrest Drive, had been transferred entirely into Nadine's name. The savings account my mother had been building for 30 years. Gone. The lake property an hour north that our father had bought before he died. Gone too. Even our mother's antique jewelry. The pearl earrings. The gold locket with our baby pictures inside. Everything, listed in the same cold legal language. My name appeared only once, near the bottom, in a line that stated I had been considered and intentionally excluded. Intentionally excluded. I read that line 3 times. The will had been signed 4 months before our mother passed. I had not been told, called, or consulted. I had driven 6 hours to the funeral, cried beside my sister at the graveside, held her hand, and all the while she had known this envelope was waiting.
She had known for months.
She had held my hand at the grave and said nothing. My name is Olivia Bennett. I was 34 years old the day I sat on that porch. I had grown up in that house. I had taken my first steps on that wooden floor, learned to ride a bike in that driveway, done homework at that kitchen table while my mother cooked. I had cried into my pillow after heartbreaks and she had come in without being asked and sat quietly beside me in the dark, because she always knew when I needed silence more than words. She had promised me once, when I was around 16, that everything she had would be split evenly between us.
She didn't say it like a speech. She said it like a fact already settled. "Everything will be fair, sweetheart." That was how she talked about the things that mattered to her. Simply. Like the truth didn't need decoration. I thought of that promise while I sat on those steps. I thought of her voice. I thought of how completely I had trusted her, and how completely I had trusted Nadine, and how neither of those things had been enough to protect me. This is the story of how my sister took our inheritance and left me with nothing. And how 13 years later, I came back and took it all back. Growing up, Nadine was the one everyone called reliable. She was 4 years older than me, and she had stayed close to home while I went to college out of state. She had a job in town, a small apartment nearby, and she came over for Sunday dinners. She drove our mother to appointments, picked up groceries, fixed things around the house when they broke. People in the neighborhood knew her by name. Everyone thought she was devoted. I thought she was devoted too. What I didn't understand then was how easily care can become control when no one is watching closely enough. Nadine wasn't just helping our mother. She was slowly making herself the only person our mother depended on. Every favor was a brick. Every errand was a foothold. Over years, without anyone noticing, she had built something sturdy and quiet around our family home. She managed the bills. She attended medical appointments alone. She knew what was in every filing cabinet and which accounts held what. I was the one who had moved away. That distance, the gap I had always thought was ordinary, the kind that exists in every family when one sibling leaves, was the opening she had been quietly building into something much larger. About a year before our mother died, the phone calls started changing. I used to call every Sunday evening. We would talk for 30 or 40 minutes, sometimes longer. She would ask about my job and my apartment.
I would ask about her garden and her book club. It was easy between us, the kind of conversation that doesn't need topics because the person on the other end is enough. Then the calls started getting shorter. Nadine would pick up and say our mother was resting. Then she was tired. Then confused. Then she didn't feel up to talking. The calls that had lasted 40 minutes started lasting 5. Sometimes Nadine said our mother had already gone to bed even when I called mid-afternoon. I told myself it was the illness. Our mother had been struggling more that year, and I wanted to be understanding about it. But looking back now, I can see it clearly. She had managed the space between me and our mother. Every time she answered and said she's not up to talking today, she made that space a little wider and harder to cross. She was cutting the thread between us slowly, carefully, in a way that looked like care. One phone call at a time. Until the distance felt completely normal to everyone around us. The will had been signed 4 months before our mother died. That fact circled inside my head for years. Not just that it had been changed, but when. For months before the end, our mother was in serious decline. She had suffered her second stroke 6 months earlier. She was on multiple medications for pain, blood pressure, and what her doctors described as cognitive fluctuation. Some days she was clear. Other days she struggled to remember what she had eaten for breakfast. I had been told the second stroke was mild. Manageable. She called me from the hospital and said not to rush home, that the doctors were pleased, our mother was comfortable and asking for her slippers. I believed her. What I didn't know was that 2 months after that stroke, while our mother was still adjusting to new medication, Nadine had arranged a meeting with a lawyer. She had driven our mother to the appointment. She had sat in the room while the documents were explained and signed. She had brought her home afterward and made her a cup of tea. Nobody called me. Nobody thought to ask whether I deserved to know. And by the time I found out, the ink had been dry for months. At the small gathering after the funeral, I tried to ask questions. The house was full of aunts, cousins, and neighbors carrying casseroles and flower arrangements, murmuring kind things about our mother. Everyone moved gently around the edges of grief, choosing soft words that didn't stick to anything difficult. When I tried to bring up the will, the room shifted. My Aunt Patrice looked past my shoulder. My cousin Wes said that Nadine had handled everything and left it right there, like that explained it. One of my mother's oldest friends patted my arm and said, "These things are complicated, honey." Nobody met my eyes for long. Nobody said the one thing I needed to hear, that something felt wrong and I had a right to ask. I understood what I was seeing. These were people who had watched Nadine manage everything for years and had quietly accepted it as the natural order of things. In their version of the story, she was the devoted daughter who stayed. I was the one who had left. And without anyone saying it plainly, they seemed to believe that staying deserved a reward. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood in my mother's living room surrounded by people and felt completely alone. The last real conversation I had with my mother was about 6 weeks before she died. Nadine had stepped out on an errand, which was rare. Usually she was somewhere nearby whenever I called. But that afternoon the phone rang through directly, and my mother picked up on the second ring. Her voice was soft and a little slow, the way it had been getting, but she was there. Fully present. We talked for almost 20 minutes. She asked about my job. I told her I had just gotten a small promotion. She said she was proud. She asked if I was eating properly. I said yes, mostly. She laughed at something I said and it sounded exactly the way it always had, quick and warm, ending in a soft exhale. Near the end of the call, she said something I carried with me for years. "Everything will be fair, sweetheart. I've made sure of it." I didn't ask what she meant. I just said, "I know, Mom." Because I did believe her. Completely. She said she loved me. I said I loved her. And we said goodbye the way you do when you believe there will be more conversations to come. Easy. Unhurried. That was the last time I heard her voice without Nadine nearby. After Nadine shut the door in my face, I had a decision to make. I could fight. I could pound on that door and demand to be let in. I could call a lawyer that afternoon and launch a legal battle with no money and no evidence behind me. Part of me wanted to do exactly that. The anger in my chest was real and heavy and needed somewhere to go. But I didn't. I sat on that step long enough to breathe.
Long enough to stop shaking. Long enough to think clearly about what I was actually up against. I had no savings. I had just lost my mother. I was carrying grief so raw it was hard to see past the next few hours. And Nadine had been preparing for this for a very long time, a lawyer, a paper trail, years of careful groundwork already in place. I had an envelope and $200. Fighting wasn't possible yet. So I made the only decision that made sense. I put the envelope in my bag, picked up my overnight bag, walked back to my car, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. Not because I accepted what had happened, but because I had to survive it first. The first 3 months after leaving, I stayed on my friend Cora's couch. Cora lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city and never once made me feel like a burden, not when I cried in her bathroom at midnight, not when I couldn't eat, not when I sat at her kitchen table for hours staring at the wall. She just kept putting cups of tea in front of me and saying, "One day at a time, live." Simple advice. But it was the only thing that helped. I found 2 jobs. A daytime position at a printing company doing data entry, and evening shifts at a grocery store 3 nights a week. The money was barely enough to cover basic expenses. The imbalance of it all carried its own sharp kind of pain. I knew what that house was worth. I knew what the lake property was worth. I had grown up believing that one day those things would provide some foundation, not luxury, just stability. The kind that lets you breathe a little easier. And Nadine was sleeping in those rooms, paying nothing on a home she hadn't earned, while I was counting bus fare. That imbalance sat inside me quietly every day. It didn't fade. It just learned to wait. 3 years after that porch, I drove back to my hometown for a weekend. I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe I needed to see it. Maybe I needed to confirm that things had really happened the way I remembered, that I wasn't carrying something larger than the actual truth. I stopped at the gas station just off the main road, the same one our family had always used growing up, and a woman called my name from across the parking lot. It was Mrs. Garland. She had lived 2 doors down from us my whole childhood. She had white hair now and walked with a slight lean, but her eyes were exactly the same. She hugged me longer than I expected. Then she pulled back, looked at me carefully, and dropped her voice. "I always wondered if I should have called you sooner," she said. "I wasn't sure it was my place." She glanced around, then back at me. "Your mother kept asking why she had signed so many papers. Toward the very end. She kept saying she didn't remember doing it." My chest tightened so hard I had to remind myself to breathe. "Signed what papers?" I asked. Mrs. Garland just pressed her lips together and shook her head slowly, like she had already said more than she knew what to do with. I drove home from that gas station with something new inside my chest. Not grief exactly. Something sharper. Something that pointed forward instead of backward. Within the month, I enrolled in night classes. I started with a course in financial compliance. The material was dry at first, regulations, procedures, terminology that felt distant from anything personal. But I paid attention. I took careful notes. I showed up every week even when I was exhausted from 2 jobs. Then I added estate administration. Then asset tracing. Then a certificate program focused on elder financial abuse and legal protections for vulnerable adults. I told myself I was building practical skills. That this was logical and nothing more. But every time a professor described how coercion worked in estate cases, how cognitive vulnerability was exploited by people close to the victim, I felt a cold recognition move through me. Like each lesson was describing a pattern I already knew from the inside. Something that had happened in a house on Ridgecrest Drive while I was too far away to stop it. I wasn't just building a career. I was building something else alongside it, slowly and quietly, the way you build something when you aren't yet ready to say what it's for. The more I learned, the more things refused to add up. I wasn't yet reviewing my own family's case officially. I wasn't pulling documents or filing any requests. But in my coursework, we studied real cases with details removed, and one pattern kept appearing so consistently that I started recognizing it the way you recognize a face you've seen somewhere before. Asset transfers made before a major health event, positioned to look like routine planning. Bank accounts shifted into joint ownership quietly, well before a person was incapacitated, so the change looked natural rather than calculated. Power of attorney activated earlier than necessary and used more broadly than intended. Wills rewritten during medication adjustment periods,
when someone was technically capable on paper but genuinely vulnerable in practice. Each individual action looked explainable on its own. Taken together, they formed a picture that was hard to misread once you knew what you were looking at. I had not yet examined my mother's estate records. In those early years I simply couldn't afford to, in any sense of the word. But I knew the shape of what had happened. I had known it from the moment I looked into Nadine's eyes on that porch and saw how calm she was. Calm the way someone is calm when they have been preparing for a very long time.
13 years passed.
I won't pretend those years were smooth or easy. There were setbacks and lean months and quiet evenings when I thought about my mother's kitchen table and felt the specific loneliness of losing a place as much as a person. There were times the whole thing seemed too old and buried to ever revisit.
But I built something real.
By the time I was 47, I had a stable career auditing estate irregularities for a firm that worked with families in disputed inheritance cases.
I had done this work for years.
I knew how to read a paper trail. I knew where people hid movements and what the hiding looked like when you pulled the right records. I knew what undue influence looked like from dozens of different angles because I had spent a decade seeing it in other people's cases, other families, other houses, other documents handed across tables.
The irony had never escaped me.
I had become exactly the kind of person who could unravel exactly the kind of thing that had been done to my own family. Whether that was accident or instinct or something else entirely, I honestly couldn't say. What I knew was simpler than that. I finally had the knowledge, the resources, and the steadiness to look closer.
So I did. I started with the public records.
Property tax filings are available to anyone who knows how to request them, and I had made hundreds of those requests throughout my career. I knew exactly what I was looking for and exactly how to read what came back.
What I found stopped me cold.
The lake property, the one my father had bought before he died, the one our family had spent summers at when Nadine and I were still girls, had been transferred into joint ownership 6 months before my mother's first stroke.
Not her second stroke. Her first.
Before anyone in the family had openly discussed her decline. Before she had received any formal diagnosis. Before the conversations about care and medications had even started. There was no logical reason for that transfer. The property had no outstanding debt.
There was no tax benefit.
There had been no family discussion about restructuring assets, none that I had ever been part of, anyway. It was a quiet move, made early, before similar moves would look suspicious later. It made the lake property easier to consolidate in the end without the consolidation appearing rushed. Someone had known what was coming and had started positioning things long before anyone else understood how serious things would become.
That someone was Nadine.
I requested my mother's medical records through proper legal channels, the same process I used in my estate audit work. 6 weeks later, the documents arrived. I spread them across my kitchen table on a Saturday morning and read through them carefully, in order. The records showed that my mother's cognitive decline had been formally noted by her doctor 8 weeks before the will was changed.
Not after. Before.
Her physician had documented episodes of confusion, difficulty with sequencing, and what the notes described as reduced capacity for complex financial reasoning.
These entries were clear and dated.
8 weeks later, the new will was signed. I understood the legal distinction well. Testamentary capacity doesn't require perfect mental clarity. A person can meet that standard while experiencing real cognitive difficulties, as long as they broadly understand what they own and who they intend to leave it to. Nadine almost certainly knew this. It was why the will wasn't fraudulent on its face. But undue influence is a different matter. A person can have legal capacity and still be manipulated by someone they love and depend on, someone who controls their environment, their information, and the choices placed in front of them.
The timeline wasn't proof. But it was a solid beginning.
The lawyer who had handled my mother's will had retired 4 years after her death. But his firm was still operating, and his former assistant, a woman named Kay, still worked there in a different role. I reached out professionally, explaining that I was reviewing archived documents related to a personal family matter. I kept my message calm and factual.
Kay agreed to a brief phone call. She was careful at first. Measured.
She had clearly thought about professional boundaries for a long time. Then I asked one specific question. I asked whether anything about the appointment had stood out to her, the timing, the circumstances, anything at all that felt unusual.
There was a pause on the line.
I always thought it felt rushed, she said quietly. The appointment was scheduled only 2 days in advance. That's not typical for a will revision. Usually there's more lead time, time for the client to reflect, ask questions, bring someone they trust. She chose her next words carefully. The client seemed distant during the signing.
I remember thinking she looked very tired.
I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. But yes, looking back, it felt rushed. I thanked her and wrote down every word before I set the phone down. The picture was getting clearer every day. While reviewing the archived documents from the law firm, I found something that had never been filed. It was a handwritten letter on plain white paper, folded once. My mother's name was printed at the top in her own handwriting, along with a date. The letter had been placed inside the file folder, perhaps brought to the appointment by my mother herself, perhaps set aside and overlooked. It had never been submitted or acted on. The date was 2 weeks before the will was signed. I read it slowly. It wasn't long. My mother had never been someone who used extra words. In her own clear, even handwriting, the same script I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists my whole life, she had written that she didn't want her daughters fighting over anything she left behind. That she had always planned to divide things equally. That Nadine was helping her with paperwork and she trusted her to make sure everything was handled fairly.
I don't want the girls fighting.
Everything should be equal. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the law firm and read those 2 sentences until the words stopped looking like words.
My mother had believed she was being taken care of. She had trusted Nadine with everything.
And Nadine had used that trust to take everything. I met with an estate litigator named Mr. Adkins on a Tuesday afternoon in March. His office was small and quiet, with stacked folders on every surface and a narrow window looking onto a side street. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the full picture. The timeline of the will change. The lake property transfer made before the first stroke. The medical records showing cognitive decline 8 weeks before the signing. Kay's account of the rushed appointment. The handwritten letter expressing my mother's actual intention in her own words. He asked a few precise questions and made notes without looking up. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Undue influence in estate cases is not easy to prove.
Courts require more than suspicious timing. But what you have is not just suspicious timing.
You have a vulnerable person under the exclusive care of the sole beneficiary. A rushed appointment. Medical documentation directly preceding the signing. And a handwritten letter from the deceased expressing a clearly different intention." He looked at me steadily.
"I won't promise you a win.
But I will tell you that you have a case worth bringing."
I had waited 13 years to hear those words.
I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face. We filed the legal petition challenging the will on a Thursday morning. I had spent 3 weeks preparing the documentation package with Mr. Adkins. Every piece of evidence was organized, dated, and clearly cross-referenced. The medical records. The property transfer filings.
The archived letter.
Kay's signed written statement. The original estate plan my father had drawn up years earlier, listing both daughters as equal heirs. Bank records showing account restructuring that had occurred gradually over the final 2 years of my mother's life. It was a careful case built entirely on documented facts. No drama.
No accusations without support.
Just the record, laid out plainly. The petition named Nadine as the respondent and argued that the will revision had been obtained through undue influence exerted over a cognitively vulnerable individual. It asked the court to declare the revised will invalid and apply the original estate plan.
There was no press.
No public announcement. I told no one in the family beforehand. I had learned from watching Nadine all those years that the most effective moves are always the quiet ones. A process server arrived at the house on Ridgecrest Drive that same Thursday afternoon.
Nadine was formally served at the front door.
The same front door she had once shut in my face. My phone rang that same evening, less than 4 hours after the papers were served. I looked at the screen. The number took me a moment to place. Then I recognized it, the landline from the house on Ridgecrest Drive.
Nadine still had the same number our mother always had.
I had not seen it on my phone in 13 years. I let it ring twice.
Then I answered.
"You're being ridiculous."
Her voice was sharp.
But underneath the sharpness there was something I had never heard in it before.
Something smaller. Tighter. A crack running through the middle of it. She was afraid.
"I'm not sure what you mean," I said. My voice was completely level.
"This is harassment. You have nothing. You left. You weren't here."
"That's the whole story." "I wasn't here because you made sure of that," I said quietly.
She went silent.
"Then, this will destroy the family." I told her the family had been damaged long before I filed anything. That what I had done was ask a court to look at the facts. And that if those facts told the story I believed they told, the outcome would be whatever it needed to be.
She hung up before I finished.
I sat with the silence afterward and noticed how steady I felt. The deposition process took several months. Mr. Adkins had prepared me for what it would actually be like. Formal interviews under oath, documents reviewed on both sides, witnesses giving their recollections on the record. It was slow and precise, nothing like the courtroom drama people imagine. Mostly quiet rooms, careful questions, and a great deal of paper. But truth has a way of becoming visible when people have to speak it under oath. Bank statements confirmed the account transfers. An account that had been solely in my mother's name was converted to joint ownership with Nadine 18 months before her death. Over the 12 months following that conversion, the balance moved steadily from that account into one held in Nadine's name alone. 2 neighbors who had visited my mother in her final year gave statements describing her as frequently confused, sometimes unsure about recent conversations and dates. A member of my mother's book club testified that in the last 6 months of her life, my mother had asked twice why she couldn't seem to reach me by phone.
She thought she must be dialing the wrong number. Nadine had never corrected her.
The story my sister had carefully constructed over 13 years began to come apart under the weight of what people actually remembered, once someone finally asked. The judge's ruling came on a gray morning in late October. I sat on one side of the courtroom with Mr. Adkins beside me. Nadine sat on the other side with her own attorney. Her posture was straight. Her expression was controlled, the same blank calm she had worn on that porch 13 years ago.
She had been careful throughout the entire process. Composed. She had not made careless mistakes or said things she couldn't take back.
But composure does not change the facts. The judge ruled that the revised will had been executed during a documented period of cognitive decline. That the sole beneficiary had held significant control over the testator's environment, information, and daily decisions. That the evidence demonstrated a clear pattern consistent with undue influence. That the rushed signing, combined with the medical records and the handwritten letter, provided sufficient grounds to declare the document invalid. The revised will was thrown out. The original estate plan, drawn up years earlier by both my parents together, would govern the distribution. Everything divided equally between the 2 daughters.
50% each. The house. The savings.
The lake property.
The jewelry.
I heard Nadine exhale slowly from across the room.
I didn't look at her.
I kept my eyes forward and let the ruling settle over me like something long overdue. The house on Ridgecrest Drive was sold under court supervision 6 months after the ruling. Before the sale closed, I was given the opportunity to walk through it one final time. My share of the proceeds would be released after closing, and once that was done, there would be no reason to return. I wanted to do it properly, slowly, without hurrying. I went on a Wednesday morning in late April.
The house had been cleared out. The furniture was gone. The walls were bare.
My footsteps echoed in a way they never had when the rooms were full. I walked through the kitchen where my mother had made Sunday dinners. I stood in the back hallway where she used to line up her gardening shoes. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the room Nadine and I had shared when we were young, before we wanted our own space. I thought about what it had taken to be standing here again.
The years. The work.
The long, quiet discipline of building something carefully when letting go would have been easier. I walked out through the front hall and stood at the door one last time. Not the girl who had been locked out on those steps. Just a woman, finishing something that had taken far too long. 13 years is a long time to carry something. When people ask if it was worth it, the question lands sideways.
Worth it compared to what?
A version of life where I simply accepted what happened and moved on. I've stopped trying to imagine that version.
Some things deserve to be corrected. Not for revenge.
Not out of bitterness. But because the truth has weight, and when it's buried, that weight doesn't disappear. It just moves into the people carrying it.
My mother had a clear intention.
She wrote it in her own hand, 2 weeks before anything was changed.
Everything should be equal. She had meant those words her whole life.
She said them to me as a teenager, wrote them on paper, and brought them to a legal appointment. She trusted the person closest to her to honor them. That trust was betrayed. I couldn't undo her final months. I couldn't give back the confusion she felt when papers appeared in front of her and her oldest daughter said just sign here. But I could make sure the outcome matched what she actually wanted.
I could make sure the truth was told.
And I could walk back through that front door not as someone being turned away, but as someone who had kept her integrity and refused to disappear.
That was everything. That was enough.